This is the Big House. It's the nickname for Michigan Stadium, home of the University of Michigan's football team in Ann Arbor, Michigan. 8 Saturdays every fall, up to 107,000 fans fill the stadium to watch the Wolverines play against that week's opponent. By capacity, it's the largest stadium in the United States. If you rewind the clock 2,000 years, there was a stadium that more than doubled that in capacity. And just like us every weekend, the ancient Romans would look forward to the empire's favorite sport, the ancient chariot races. And most of them would gather at the city's biggest venue, the Circus Maximus. The stadium at its peak would have held over double that of the Big House. Some estimates place it as high as 250,000 Romans, which according to the Roman author Pliny, was potentially a quarter of the population of Rome. The circus was a specific type of arena. It was shaped like a bullet and it was 5.5 times longer than a football field. There were other venues in Rome. This is the ancient Circus Flaminius, which would have looked something like this in its day. And this is what's left of the Circus Maximus, built sometime around 300 AD. But the largest of antiquity was the Circus Maximus, the name literally meaning the biggest circus. Now, the Circus Maximus is old, very old. It dates all the way back to the time of the 5th king of Rome in the 5th century BC. For some context, that's 6 centuries before the Colosseum. Over time, the stadium became the largest in the world, and the spectators went from sitting on grassy slopes to seats made of stone. The venue's peak being around 100 AD during the reign of Trajan, when Trajan refurbished the stadium largely made of wood with magnificent structures of marble and stone. The stadium was able to be built quicker than ever with the newly discovered building material, concrete. The venue is located in Rome in a valley between 2 hills, the Palatine Hill and the Aventine Hills. Trajan's structure was incredible, and according to Pliny, it was as beautiful as a temple. It was also massive, 545 meters long and 80 meters wide. Its main purpose was to provide a venue for chariot races, or the Ludi Romani, the Roman Games. The games were hosted and sponsored by rich, powerful men. The Ludi could be half of full-day events. Initially, the games were held annually or biannually, but as the population grew, the games became somewhat of a status symbol for the hosting. Eventually, they were held once a week, and the need for other venues quickly arose, hence the building of the Colosseum, which began in 72 AD. The enormous popularity of the games is reflected in a number of sources. For example, the Roman poet Juvenal wrote a few times the line, "All of Rome is in the circus today." Augustus would at times station groups of soldiers at various points around the city to prevent looting and other citizens from taking advantage of the practically deserted streets. The Circus Maximus was designed for chariot races, but there were also other events held there, including gladiatorial combats and animal hunts, some of which were exotically spectacular. For example, Pompey, one of Rome's most famous generals, organized a contest between a group of barbarian gladiators and 20 elephants. Now, the races were raucous, wild, dangerous, and a gambler's paradise. The stadium had 2 long parallel sides and one rounded end with seating all around. The other end was filled with stables and starting boxes. Down the center of the racetrack ran a low wall, or a spina, which contained decorative sculptures that would have been tilted to let spectators know how many laps had been completed. Now, as mentioned, chariot racing was wildly dangerous, which was part of the show. The most popular and expensive seats were at the curved end of the arena. This is where most of the crashes would happen. The slang term for a chariot crash in Roman times was a shipwreck. The shipwrecks, which were tangled masses of horses, drivers, and wood, would careen off the corner and would leave you either excited or upset depending on who you were cheering for. A standard day at the races saw up to 24 events. The format had between 4 and 12 chariots racing in teams. There were 4 teams called factions, which were identified by their colors: blue, green, red, and white. Fans followed their team colors just as much as they followed individual drivers or horses. Each team had its own scouts for finding talented riders and horses. These men were mainly slaves or very poor free men. Each faction is just like today. They had fanatical supporters. When the race started, the emperor presiding official would drop a white cloth, and the horses exploded from the gates. Their starting positions were assigned by lottery. This is a rendering of the hippodrome, which was built in Byzantium and flourished in the heyday of Constantinople. But its design is similar to the circus, and I thought it would provide a good visual. Chariot riders drove to win. They would jockey and slam into each other's chariots to gain position. You could whip, lash your opponents, and try to pull them out of their chariots if that's what you wished. The more chariots in a race, the more dangerous it would be. If the factions had multiple chariots in the race, the riders would work together to gain position. As they approached the turns, drivers tried to turn as tight as possible to the barrier to save time. Or if they hugged it too tightly, they would crash. A driver sometimes could smash his chariot and still be entangled in the reins and drug behind his horse. And this was all part of the spectacle. They would do the circuit of the circus 7 times, 7 laps being required to complete the race. The race laps were marked with little golden dolphins that were tipped as each lap was finished. Now, the best charioteers could earn a great deal of prize money, and if they were slaves, they could also earn their freedom. The prize money for up to 4th place was advertised beforehand, and that would go to the driver's specific faction. Drivers could become celebrities throughout the empire simply by surviving, as the life expectancy of a charioteer was not very high. For example, there was a famous driver named Scorpus who won over 2,000 races before being killed in a race at the age of 27. The most famous of all was Gaius Appius Diocles, who won 1,400 out of his 4,200 races for various teams over a 24-year career before retiring at the age of 42. As you can tell, detailed records were kept of drivers' performances, the names, breeds, and pedigrees of famous horses. Betting on results was widespread among all classes and was part of the show at the games. This is a modern depiction from 1876 by a French artist of a chariot race that took place in the Circus Maximus. The vantage point is as it's seen from the starting gate. The Palatine Hill and the Imperial Palace are to the left. Seats in the circus were free for the poor and either free or subsidized for the masses. And according to our friend Juvenal, a great way to distract the masses from their lack of involvement in politics, bread, and circuses. The wealthy could pay extra for shaded seats where they had a better view, and the circus was one of the few places where the elite, in particular the emperor, could be seen by a populace assembled in vast numbers. The sponsor or editor of the races shared a viewing box and its couches with the images of gods. An interesting note on the Circus Maximus: one of Rome's most famous events was the Great Fire in 64 AD. On a July night of that year, a fire began and burned for almost 6 days. In the aftermath, almost 2/3 of Rome had been burned. The fire had actually been started in the circus. It was a dry summer and it was windy that day, and near the stadium there were stalls and shops, many filled with hay. After the fire ignited, it rapidly spread across the city, and it was devastating. The Emperor Nero rebuilt, and the chariot races became a large focal point of distraction from the loss. The last race was ran at the circus in 549 AD. Today, little is left of the old stadium. You will find a large field in which the shape is still recognizable and a few small ruins. But at one point, it was probably the busiest building on Earth. The lower levels were prone to flooding and were gradually buried under waterlogged soil and debris, so that the original track is now buried 6 meters beneath the modern surface. Stands were eventually demolished and stones were used for new churches and palaces. For many tourists, the Circus Maximus is not an overly spectacular place to visit. There's only a small part of the southeast stand left, a few arcades, and the contours are clearly visible in the large grassy area. But if you're in Rome, it's a historic place where if you use your imagination, you can still get an idea of a scene that was once magnificent. If we invoke our friend Juvenal one final time, at one point on certain days, it was a place where all of Rome would be at the circus.